of the government case in this debate is clear. People should know things about them that change the preferences they have and the way they behave. People know fundamental identity traits about them, whether it be their gender, their sexuality, or the base things that influence the way they behave themselves. People know about their families and the situations that might influence them. People know about their culture and things that will lead them to be valued more or less. People know about the economic opportunities around them and the ways they will likely influence themselves. We say one of the things that most clearly influences the decisions you make and the prioritizations you engage in throughout your life is how long you are likely going to live. The fact that individuals do not know that and assign enormous risk premium to the potential of dying too old or too young is awful for them and awful for society. We don't think this needs a model. If they have any clarifications, I guess we can go through them. So I want to talk about two things in this debate. Firstly, I want to explain why it's better for individuals and the decisions that they're capable of making. Secondly, I want to talk about why this is likely to lead to better social outcomes, both in terms of the way that people make decisions for themselves in an aggregate, but more importantly about social and political capital and the way that's aggregated when you have figures who know they are going to die young. Firstly, on individuals. We say this is the thing you ought to care about most, given it's the unit on which society is built, but also because knowing this is something that you have to yourself and you can choose to disclose to individuals, presumably in the manner that you can choose to disclose other things that people come to know about themselves during the process of growing up in life. So the most immediate and tangible and universal impact is how this influences the individual. We say individuals know almost everything about themselves except for this particular trait in the status quo, and that's a trait that is enormously influential to them. We don't see a reason why individuals ought to be barred from having access to other things that tell them information that's useful to them. So what we have to do in this debate is justifiably prove that this is something that individuals should know, and that is sufficient to justify this being something that is preferable for individuals to be granted as a piece of knowledge. Two reasons that's the case. Firstly, because it removes substantial amounts of dread and uncertainty for all individuals. That is, when you face in life an anvil hanging over you of uncertain and unpredictable causes significantly affecting your life from things you can't predict because of structurally rare medical conditions, hereditary conditions that haven't been picked up yet, or that you can't afford to access information to because 23andMe is incredibly expensive as an annual medicals for people to access, that means large numbers of people feel significant harms to their lives when they don't know what's going to happen. The fear of what is around the corner is what has motivated individuals to join often coercive religions for very many years in the past. We think the way it impacts people's decision-making and general anguish is awful regardless of what that might be. That is, we say individuals in general have value to certainty and are very scared and risk-averse by the lack of information. That is also, in particular, likely to be harmful for those people who do leave this mortal coil too early in ways that they can't anticipate on their side of the house, and that substantially negatively impacts them. Critically, while we acknowledge there are other unpredictable reasons you might die, people feel far more in control of their driving, even if it is likely they're going to die from an accident. They feel in control of their medical process or the likelihood they randomly have a heart attack. So the fact these biological causes are often the things which you have the least control over are why they create the greatest amount of fear. Secondly, irrespective of the uncertainty value, we say there's a need to be able to make trade-offs based on utility and what your likely future, utility time span is going to look like. Look, this is a bit econ-y, but all of life is an economic optimization problem where you solve a Lagrangian constraint around the life that exists with you. Trade-offs are often visceral, affect third parties like your family, like the pension that you invest versus the amount you spend on your children's education, and often are affected significantly by tail risks in the status quo. We say that's harmful for all people, but particularly for people who suffer from rare diseases, where cancer can often be something that lies dormant, people can bounce back from, and often can lead to devastation for individuals in ways that they and doctors can't predict. We say that for those people, but also for all people, the trade-offs of knowing where you're going to die and therefore being able to plan appropriately for that level of future are enormous. It means you can adequately invest more in certain causes for your family or for charitable instances that you think will create social good with the certainty value of knowing that you're not trading off with your own existence, make it more likely that individuals will be charitable and invest in things that are good for their family and society. Sure.
So I'm sort of just confused by all this, because you talk about all these diseases like heart attacks, they're all curable and preventable. So presumably they don't fall into the paradigm of the natural expiration date that can't be avoided.
Sorry, so I mean, to the extent that you've mitigated some of our benefits, I'm not really bothered in the round, but there are also just the case that individuals have, for example, aortas that are strangely wired and can misfire in ways that presumably this test would be able to determine, given the way the info slide was put up. But critically, for people with diseases, this is obviously something that is often not preventable, where there are just very different types types of cystic fibrosis, for example, that are difficult to predict, some of which allow you to live a happy life to the age of 50, and some of which cause you to die at the age of 20. We think it's relevant for stakeholders like your parents and family, and you have to decide whether to take the incredibly expensive, invasive, and painful treatment of preventative pills that basically have like a 2 to 3% impact on your ability to transition from one form of the disease to the other, knowing with some deterministic value whether you're in the form of a disease that will cause you to die or not allows you to make better trade-offs for yourself. It's also things like risky endeavors, right? At the point where you know that you are likely to die in the short run, you're more likely to take adventures like, say, skydiving that give you enormous amounts of pleasure in the status quo, even if that ups your risk of dying. And that's as true for people without diseases as with. It is just true that you are capable of making decisions that both help other people and give everyone certainty, value, and closure at the point where you have a much more definite note at the point at which you will expire. Sure.
Clarification. So does this predict, for example, things that you would change your mind of that would impact your death? So if you decide not to take pills, would it predict that you're going to decide not to take those pills and then die or live?
I mean, like, I don't know if the world is deterministic or not, and I suspect that would be the case, that would be affected by the model. Like, to some extent, this is like a problem with the way that, like, I don't know what you want, like, I can do realistically about this, other than to say there is presumably some finite limit that can be put that with reasonable precautions can be taken, but not the most extreme precautions. At the point where, like, there's a 5% chance that taking very aggressive chemotherapy turns you from 25 to 50, I don't think the test is going to reasonably take that into account, and so you presumably have some ways of extending your life in the most extreme circumstances, but broadly we think this is a hard ceiling. Let's talk about social outcomes and the ability to lift up the boat of the most marginalized people who often suffer incredibly hard on opposition side of the house as a result of the fact that they're systematically under-neglected and have lack of access to economic and political resources. On our side, we eliminate substantial amounts of uncertainty. Some people who suffer from these illnesses are likely to be able to live for extended periods of time. They are more likely to be hired, enter political office, and be able to optimize for that longer run period of life, at which point they create social capital through role models, political advocacy, and investing money in causes they care about that help lift the tide of all oppressed people. Whereas on your side of the house, the risk aversion that a company or a political party faces from electing someone who might die in 5 years is so sufficiently high that they don't end up hiring these people in the first place. So on our side, we get at least some of those people entering vessels of power, at which point they can lift up the attitudes of everyone else. But we also create visceral attitudes and role models to the point where someone who is, say, white and privileged, but for whatever reason has a rare medical condition, can say, I had to plan for my death at 35, have everyone around me sympathize with it, and go through the suffering that entails. That creates enormous, visceral, person-to-person suffering in such a way that you're likely to get substantial changes in the way people see themselves and other people around them. We propose.
Yeah, thanks the Prime Minister for those remarks. Just remind the panel, stop taking notes when we get that back. And then let's have the Leader of Opposition if everyone's ready. Yeah.
I'm going to give three-ish points of rebuttal to Harry, and then I'm going to talk muse on the uncertainty of life and why that brings joy in a way that maybe doesn't fit in with modern debating, but at the same time I think will be fun, and I'm going to do anyway. 3 points of rebuttal. The first one is actually just going to be about this notion of seeking cures or not, because I think this is something that does mean you're contradicting the info slide. We know they are gospel in debates, so we probably have to care about them to some degree. Premise is that nothing can ultimately impact this expiration date. That means presumably there is no circumstance where a curable disease is something that you can engage with, because if it's curable, it can affect the expiration date. So presumably it's something that is a natural cause that is independent of any form of treatment. So to the extent then we know maybe some diseases literally are incurable and no degree of human science ever could do it, fine. But given we know that is no disease we've encountered so far, we think this is a marginal benefit at best. The second thing is on this notion that people are going to be hired all of a sudden because there's now not a risk they could die in 5 years. Like, this is about only the individual knows this, and they can be afraid that you're lying to them, and as a consequence, because there's no downside to the lies, you'll be dead. I think that's a pretty big situation where that isn't going to change the status quo. That uncertainty for a hirer is still there. The uncertainty only changes for the individuals, and that is important. The third thing is this weird thing about giving your money away. Like, premises, we have a wonderfully charitable individual whose wife's doing this, but they're only now going to do it because they're afraid they're going to die. Counterfactual, they die, they have all this money, and they're a wonderfully charitable individual. I imagine some of it's probably still going to go to charities through the forms of wills. And if they're not charitable and will give it to their family anyway, it would still go to the family through the form of wills. We don't get to change the status quo in that situation because death does have some implications which you have to accept. Main argument, uncertainty of life. I think there is a joy to the uncertainty of life, and I think that is something that is absolutely destroyed in this world. Under the status quo, none of us know when we're going to die, but we do all live with the belief that we can extend our lives. The distinction is that there is now not complete certainty when we die, there is just an upper ceiling. There is a limit that we know we cannot go beyond, and there's a limit at which we know we cannot pass. The counterfactual is living in what is a deterministic world, a knowledge that no action whatsoever can improve our situations, but a constant fear that we can make it worse, that we can do things that mean we are going to end up in a worse situation, and where even if we are completely perfect, we only get to a certain day. I think that's an awful world to live in. I think that knowledge is continuous and crushing, and is something that is oppressive on every single individual. I'm going to talk briefly about how this affects the individual and the way we construct ourselves, and then I'm going to talk about how this affects actions related to others. Before that, go.
Broadly, everyone in this room understands we're not going to live past 110 or so. Why is a variable limit that might be sometimes a little lower significantly different than an upper limit that we still all understand to be fairly certain?
So, I mean, I don't think it is that certain. I'm pretty confident myself I can live longer, but at least we have this knowledge that, and I'm going to actually explain why there's a significant difference here. Living every day with the dread of the countdown on your life is something that is the change. This will, in a roundabout way, answer the point. And this countdown on your life is something which you pretty much know from the day you're born. It's something you have to always try and deal with. The knowledge that you are not going to live past this very specific point. At this age, you will die. This is something which is crushing and oppressive, because under the status quo, I think, yeah, it's true, you probably know there is this massively far off limit in the future that we might not live beyond. We always tend to be probably extended a little bit. But the thing that's important is I think when we're young, none of us really think about death all that much. It's something we push away. And I do think this is a defensive mechanism. We try to enjoy life at the moment. It's something we don't want to confront, and it's something we don't need to confront because it's not constantly hanging over us. It's something that I think every human learns to come to terms with over the course of their lifetime. And that when ultimately most of us do pass away, as most people do from natural causes at old age, most people are kind of peaceful with it at that point, because you've had a whole lifetime where this hasn't been something you needed to confront at every single point in your life. It's been something you have been able to push away, you've been able to enjoy your life in the moment, and then come to terms with it when you are ready. Here's the difference. Under this world, it is something you never get that time to come to accept. It is something that you always need to confront from the moment you are a child. Because it is something you inexorably are moving towards. It is a date you are marching towards. And nothing you can do can change the fact that you know every step you take brings you closer to shuffling off your mortal coil at this very particular moment. I think knowing that as a child is something that is horrible. And I think it does actually have a number of implications in terms of the way in which you're going to live your life. I think, as a basic one, it makes regret worse. Every single misstep you take matters more, because you know this very quantifiably wasted time of your life that you have not been doing good things towards moving towards this ultimate end. Again, I think the difference is that under the situation we have at the moment, we don't think about things in that way when we are young. We possibly do when we're older. We have more life experience at that point and are able to come to terms with it. Now, every single misdecision we make is something that we know is wasted time. Everything is always done in the knowledge that we are going to die at a very particular point. I think that's something that is horrible. I think that creates a pressure from our youth in a clear way, and I think that's something that is problematic. I think it also creates a situation where you always are going to believe there's not time to start again if you get things wrong, because you know exactly how long you have. And I think when there's a sense that you know you can't really change things, because potentially if you go down this path, you have only 30 years to rectify. I think that's something that does really constrain the choices you want to make. It means you don't follow things that are your passion because you're afraid that if you ultimately mess up, there is no time you will have to recover and live an adequate quality of life. I think a situation where you have uncertainty is one where you're liberated from it. I think a world where everyone feels terrible and everyone feels this dread is something that is problematic. And I think it does matter in this respect, because when we talk about utility and consequentialism in debating, ultimately what we're talking about is the value people ascribe to their lives, and ultimately how happy we're going to be throughout the course of our life and ultimately when we die. I think if literally everyone feels awful throughout the entirety of their lives, or at large points of their life have this horrific sense of dread over them, that's a worse life for everyone. And I think a world where literally every single human being has to go through this all the time is a world which is worse than one we currently live in.
If you were diagnosed with cancer at 8, do you think it would be reassuring or scary to know that you're going to live to 60?
You're not going to necessarily live to 60 because there can be actions which can make you less likely to live. And I think cancer is a curable disease. The cure might not work in this individual instance because tumours are a bit random and the drugs don't necessarily treat them. So again, what you're talking about is there are things which can potentially lower your life. You still have that fear of that getting lowered even more. You just know there's an upper limit beyond which you cannot go. So it doesn't give you comfort, it just gives you dread. That's the distinction. Second argument, how this impacts the way in which you deal with things. I think this means you might be likely to do bad things. And I think there's sort of two ways in which this applies. I think the first way is that it does make you value the lives of other people less. Because life is now not a subjective experience that we ascribe a particular value to, but it's a quantifiable unit of time that we know is very particularly finite for every individual. Their actions are completely independent of how long this is going to be. And I think that makes it much easier for people to go and violate that sanctity of other people's lives. I think this is effectively a nebulous point, but at the same time I do think a situation where we ascribe less value to life because it is quantifiable as opposed to something that we think we can extend is an important shift in the way we view things. I think the second thing is you just do stupid stuff. Harry tries to say this is a good thing, that you get this pressure to do reckless things like skydiving. I don't think you get a lot of pleasure from that. I think it's a situation where you're doing something because you're afraid you're never going to be able to do it again. You're afraid of death. And I think that's something that is not a real choice that brings you happiness, it's a choice out of fear. And I don't think you gain value from that. I think it's a situation where you potentially harm others doing reckless stuff because, I don't know, you died much younger and then you have a family who presumably miss you. Or it's a situation where you ultimately gain no pleasure. Ultimately, it's a world where you're worse off, very happy with your life.
We thank the Leader of Opposition. We'll have the milk on the chair.
This debate happens in a global context, and the reality is the majority of people in the world think they're going to live for a far shorter time than is theoretically possible. The vast majority of people in the world face changeable circumstances such as poverty, such as curable disease, and such circumstances where they see people around them dying from, which they themselves suffer from, which whether they doom them into a 10 or 5-year existence, which are terrifying. What we do on our side of the house is prove that even if your time might be finite, it is far longer for the vast majority of people than we expect. This is what gives you hope, this is what can bring you this is what brings you happiness, and this is what gives you some comfort. Because for most people, death is all around you from the moment you were born. You're born in a war zone where you lose your family, you're born in poverty where people can't eat, you're born with a father with cancer, you're born with cancer, you're born with disease yourself, right? It is a minority of children that are protected from this. It is a minority of children that are not aware of this from an early age. And we think we provide possibility as opposed to fear. This is what we bring you in OG. The vast majority of this is going to be interwoven, but a couple of points of extraneous rebuttal, right? So firstly, I wanted to say that, like, in the status quo, you can only do things that make it worse because people think that they can only hurt their life prospects, not help their life goals. Reckon that most things you have to do in order to extend your life they range from the unpleasant to the actually miserable. It is like less fun for me to eat a salad than it is to a fried egg. It is also much less fun for me to take like drugs that make me feel very nauseous and very sick in order to keep going. Also, note too that there was massive pressure to extend your life. There's pressure because like we see life as intrinsically good and having intrinsic value, irrespective of the quality. You're saying that only people around you might have realistic obligations. All of this means that there exists a massive pressure to extend your life, even when it is improbable or even when it is unlikely. This means that if there's any chance, you always have to default to the life extending option, even if it's going to make you abjectly miserable. It is far better to be able to make those utility trade-offs so those are having to put all your hope in a life extending thing that may or may not work. This is the best way that you can potentially maximise the pleasure that you have in the future. They also told you that kids never have time to accept things. So firstly, I can say like things that like even if things are awful, if you live with them from day one, they don't tend to cause you day-to-day trauma, day-to-day difficulty. Right? This is why like people diagnosed with diseases from an early age aren't always like miserable and living every day in abject fear, right? We think you can become acclimatized to things even if they seem reprehensible to us now. But when you're a kid, you don't like really think you're going to grow up. Like no 5-year-old thinks they're ever going to become their grandparents. It's not really the way kids reason. So we think that like insofar as they're worried about this oppressive thing on like the very privileged youth that don't think they're going to die very young, we think it's mitigating because that's not the way that children think. But then they wanted to tell us that you're more likely to do bad things. Recognise we think you develop a code of morality which brings you independent pleasure, right? We think that the utility trade-offs are making our lives happy within that framework of morality. That is to say, like, I learned from a young age that it makes me happy when I make other people happy, so I'm going to continue to engage in those things because those bring me utility and morality. We think that insofar as most kids conceptualise this when they're very young or far away from this point. They're finding like you're going to do more risky things. So we think that like while this means that if you're 80, you might as well go skydiving, people still do want to have those for 80 years, so aren't going to do things to compromise them in the interim. Okay, substantive. So why do we think the majority of people are going to live longer than they expect to in the status quo? Let's talk about a couple of different demographics. I've talked about like people who are like in conflict zones, those are the most obvious cases. But also like the vast majority of people in the world who live in poverty or die from poverty-related causes. If you see everybody around you dying, if you think that no one ever gets past the age of 20 or 30 in your community, it creates very little incentive for you to work hard, for you to strive out of it, because it feels inevitable that at some point things are going to kill you. This is especially true because it's not like when you're like a very young kid, there's not often an understanding of what it is that kills you. It's not if like you've never seen anyone live past the age of 40, there's not an understanding that is possible for someone like you, and that there are measures and means that you can live your life which can potentially extend it, right? There's not the awareness that Al has that you can potentially live forever, because like nobody around you has done that, and the model that has been presented for you don't behave in that way. What this means that like you live with a death immediately. You feel like you can't, and like all of the harms that that gives you come into play, right? You feel like you can't, no incentive to try hard, no investments to the future, no incentive to do any of that. Second, you've got to take an endpoint is people with disability. Now, most disabilities don't actually kill you, right? As Al so rightly points out, my disability is going to make my day-to-day shittier, but it's not going to actually shorten my life. Because we associate it with death, right? People assume that when you're diagnosed with an illness, you're definitely going to die. People look at me and assume that I'm definitely going to die younger, even if that's not the case, right? Not only does this affect the way people treat me, insofar as people are less likely to marry me, people are less likely to hire me, because things are short-term investment, but it also means that people with disabilities themselves don't have hope and then don't want to, live their life feeling that they're going to die far shorter. It gives them a tremendous amount of hope. No, thank you. And insofar as most people around the world get diagnosed with diseases, even if they might be curable, you can't be certain of that, and the fear is really overwhelming. We think you bring hope to a vast majority of people. We think the only people who don't bring hope to are the people who have access to the longest lives, who are most likely to have the protection of childhood when 80 seems amassed away. Before I go on to closing.
Yeah, so on your point of people living in poverty who are likely to die of diseases at early ages, insofar as you say that's included under your model, don't you think it's pretty terrible if you know you're going to die at the age of 20? How does that impact the way you live your life?
So first, I think there's a difference between match we thought you were talking about diseases that can't be cured in the status quo. But these things like malaria can be cured because they're just not because of poverty. Different distinction of disease than what Harry was talking about. But now let's talk about the practical impacts of this, right? Because recognise that, in this robust 002, a lot of the fear that we have of death currently is the fear that death actually has on life. That is to say, people won't make friends with me, people won't date me, people won't marry me because they perceive me as ill. Similarly, I think that when people worry that when they get older they'll be rejected by society because people don't actually remind us of death, right? Now what you do is you normalise the idea that people are going to die and people are going to die at various ages. And crucially, you normalise that from being young. Because Al says people are going to die, but when people are 10 or people are 5, you kind of talk about it on the playground. When are you going to die? When are you going to die? That's the sort of conversation that young children have. What this means is that kids create connections with people who are going to die at the age of 30 and are going to die at the age of 60 and do it relatively arbitrarily, right? You start caring about people and you develop relationships knowing that the time is finite, and thus you decouple the value between death and the effect that it has to have on your life. And your worth, right? Suddenly death does not have to be a constraining factor and does not have to be perceived as a constraining factor on the quality of life you will have. This is great for people like me, this is great for people whose lives are constrained, or these people, great people whose lives look like they're going to be constrained, like people who live in poverty, right? We think that's great, yeah.
So if my friends and family knew they were going to die at 80, but instead died at the age of 9 because they're shot or trapped dysentery, does this not shatter the sense that I will live longer that you say is the motivating factor to stay at poverty?
Okay, it's a comparative bit, right? In the status quo, you assume everybody is going to die because that's all you see. At least you know you have the hope of it if there's nothing else to model it for you. We give comparatively more hope on our side of that. But we also think, we think you discourage the fear of death, but insofar as something is incredibly normalised, which you've known it since you're about 5, we think you're also less likely to be afraid of it. It's something in the back of your mind, right? That no longer becomes this massive existential thing, because we think if something is familiar, something is constant for your life, even if it is scary, you're less likely to think about it, less likely to dwell on it. This provides people comfort as they get older and comfort as they get close to it, because it's something they become more and more used to. It also allows them to do the trade-off. And thirdly and finally, just to elaborate a little bit on what Harry says, it also decouples to an extent the association between privilege and long life. That is to say, there will be white, rich men who will die at the age of 30, who want people who die at the age of 30 to have all the opportunities that people who die at the age of 60 have. This means that for the first time, you get people advocating to give people jobs, to give people lives, to give people marriages, who might otherwise be rejected by mainstream society to have those things because people think that their time on earth should be a constraining factor on those. For the first time, you have all rich white men not thinking they're going to live forever and advocating for people who won't and trying to make the world a better place for them. These are those vulnerable people I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Cool. We thank the GPM. Let's have the yellow.
There is an anvil hanging over all of our heads. And knowing when that anvil will drop is probably the scariest thing. for you. Because as you count down the days of the calendar to the day you will die, you realize what life means, and that's when you truly, truly fear. And that's what constrains you from being able to do things that make life meaningful. I've got 3 things to talk about in this speech. First of all, on the idea of dread and uncertainty, and why this makes people a whole lot less happy is what Alistair talked to you about. Secondly, a lot of rebuttal against the things they tell you about, how this makes interactions with people actually worse. And lastly, if I have time, a bit on life-extending treatment. On just a metaphysical level, we think it's less likely that people, that over time, people will actually get lower life expectancies. So, dread and uncertainty, right? I'm gonna highlight Al's point with a thought experiment, okay? Let's say you live in a house, and every day you have to walk out of the house through a street. You have to do it, okay? Just because that's life, and just like life, you have to live life. You have to walk out of that street. Now, you know you're in a pretty sketchy neighborhood, and there's a non-zero chance one day a masked man with a knife will come and murder you. You know that's going to happen at some point. Now, if you don't know when that's going to happen, but you know it will happen because the chance is non-zero, and as time goes to infinity, you know that things with non-zero probability are guaranteed to happen, then you don't really care, right? Because every day you go there, there are 80, 90 years ahead of you where this could happen one day, but you put it on the back of your mind because you have no idea when this is going to happen, right? And that's for most of us living, our lives without knowing when the end is. That's what we think, right? We know death is a certainty at the end of the road. We all know that. But because we don't know exactly when it is, it's something very easy to put out of your mind. Because our conception of time means that 90 years is a whole lot of time, right? I've lived for 20 years. 90 years is still the vast majority of my life. Now let's say you do know when this masked man will come to kill you. You say you know he will kill you on December the 26th, 2025. As the days go on to that day, you begin to fear. You begin to count the days in which this masked man will kill you. And on the day you walk out of your house on that specific day, that is when you know true dread, because you can see death coming right in the face, despite you knowing, despite all that you've tried to do. And that is where we say the ultimate fear and the ultimate dread of death really comes. It's knowing when it is likely to happen in the future. It is because, given the huge uncertainty of death right now, it means we don't fear it because it could happen. The chance of you dying tomorrow is very, very low. When you know it's happened, that is when the fear guarantees to exist. And that is where I think the harms are. The harms on their side of the house when they talk about fear of death is that it is spread out over many, many years. The fear that we have is guaranteed because the day you know you're going to die, that is when you start fearing. What else did they tell you on dread? They tell you, religion. People will not turn to religion because they no longer fear. Right. The reason people turn to religion is not because they fear death, but they fear what happens to life after death. They fear that they will go to, maybe they'll go to hell. And that means that they are more likely to turn towards religion. And if you know you're going to, die at the age of 35, that is when you're more likely to turn to religion because you are scared of that impending death that's going to happen within the next 5 years. On our side of the house, yes, people might be scared of death. But they don't know when they're going to die. They have years to come, years upon which they grow older, they gain wisdom, they gain the ability to comprehend and understand that death knows science. And that's when you're less likely to turn to religion, because you've found meaning within yourself. When you are young, when you're inexperienced, when you know you're going to die, that is when you're more likely to turn to the horrible religions that opening government talked about. What is the impact of this point? It's very clear. People are just less happy. People are scared. Maybe they aren't scared, when death is 50 years away. But when death is around the corner, you feel perfectly fine, and you know that you're going to die of an aneurysm tomorrow. That is where you get true fear, and that fear we think is so terrible because it threatens your very existence. It's something that we're so happy to avoid. If you die of an aneurysm without knowing, 30 seconds, you're gone. There is no fear, there is no dread. Yes?
Most people die earlier than they could live if it weren't for factors like poverty. When you can justifiably show this, don't you create not just hope, but pressure to improve access to health and other social services?
Respond to that later, okay? When I respond to most of your some of your arguments. But secondly, actions, right? And this is what Al talks about. People commit actions that hurt other people. The point here is, right? A lot of times people don't do things because they know that there's going to be harm done upon them. Like if I commit a crime, if I do something terrible, that I might find fault. I will go to jail. The point now is you no longer have that fear of going to jail. You no longer have the fear of things happening to you because you know you're going to die, say, tomorrow. That means people who are about to die, who know when they're going to die, are much more likely to commit these kinds of crimes. They say people have moral fabrics. Yes, they do. But a lot of people also don't. And the reason they don't commit terrible things is because they fear the consequences. If you know death is around the corner, you're less likely to fear the consequences. People are much worse off. And thirdly, on regret, right? They tell you that you will regret not doing things in life. And that having a timer means that you're likely to do the things that you want to. The point here is people are pushed to do these things because of the fear of regret, right? The thing is, on our side of the house, you don't get that regret. Why? Because you're living life, you know that you have an amount of time in the future in which you can do these things. When you die, you no longer feel that regret because you're dead and you cannot feel regret. As a result, you're much less likely to feel regret, right? Because the moment you've actually gone past the corner, you no longer fear. On their side of the house, though, you're 30. You're going to die at 32. You have 2 years left to do all the things you want to do. That is when you feel regret. And the push towards doing so many of these things because of that regret that pushes you to do these kinds of things, the pressure that it places upon you to achieve what you think you should do in life is precisely what makes life so terrible. No thanks. We win the regret argument. Okay. So responding to a lot of these strange things they do, right? They say one. Doing fun things. Bobby tells you, people eat salad, that's bad. Okay, maybe you'll still die at 60, but maybe you won't die fat and unable to leave your house. That is a good thing. It means quality of life is improved. That is good. The second thing it says, you will do good things to communities where you see everyone dying at the age of 20. Yes, and you will see that anyways because they're all dying at the age of 20, and if you care about them on your side of the house as much as we do, then you're likely to go and help them, right? Just seeing the fact that you're going to die at 20 is unlikely to change that sort of outcome, because if presumably you care about people dying at 20, you will still see people dying at 20, so the communities are unlikely to be affected, you're likely to help them anyways. The last thing they say then is, disabled people, right? Like, what happens to disabled people and the way people interact with these individuals? No thank you, right? Okay, first off, I think it is just nice to say no thank you, that most people realize that if you see a disabled person, they're probably not likely to die, right? Like, I mean, I think that's just generally a true thing when you see a disabled person. You don't like to judge them based on their mortality. But if you are, and you know someone is about to die, I think that's when you stop loving them. That's when you question yourself as to whether or not you should marry them, whether or not you should be friends with them, whether or not you should have kids with them, because you realize, right, that there is a timer on there's a fixed amount of time that they have. And that is when these people, the disabled people that opening governments seem to care about, don't get to experience things like love, because people are afraid that they're going to die. They know when they're going to die, and that's when they still reach their hand out. If you see a disabled person, it means you're less likely to help them. Now, lastly, on life extending treatment, right? Presumably, you have in this motion, you have a fixed amount of time. So you have a fixed amount of time at the end of the road, and you know that nothing can change that. Sure. The point now is demand for life-extending treatment decreases. Why? Because one, individuals have less of a self-interest to do that, right? Because you know when you're going to die, nothing will change that. You don't have any self-interest to push that boundary. But second of all, it means people in general will care less, right? Because they see you as being something with a finite number, which means in the future you're going to die anyways. What's the point of trying to extend your life? What does this effect have? It means you get generally less research and advancement into life-extending treatments. What does that not affect anyone in the current generation? It means people in the future are likely to have shorter lives because there is less incentive now and self-interest now for people to extend these kinds of treatments. I'll leave you up with a simple case study, right? People with Huntington's disease very often know when they're going to die, but they choose specifically not to be told that they have Huntington's disease, specifically because they fear death, specifically because they fear the future. Very proud to oppose.
Okay, thanks to the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Let's have the Member of Parliament. Check it.
Opening government's correct that for some people, they believe that they're going to die very soon. So I'm going to posit that for the vast majority of people, the overriding human tendency towards optimism leads you to believe that you're going to die in around 80 years. And I think that that's true for the vast majority of people. We get kind of a hand wave towards global context from opening government. But I don't think to say this debate exists in a global context means this debate exists in a context where everybody thinks they're going to die in 5 years or in 3 years. I think the vast majority of people believe they're going to die in a very long time. The way that that operates from closing governments, we're going to tell you that this leads people to defer happiness. It leads people to make choices that they're going to enjoy far down the road and not enjoy in the short term. Moreover, though, we think it leads people to construct relationships with other people that's based on that kind of deferred happiness and a lack of knowledge that they're going to they're going to lose that loved one. So the thing that we miss from opening opposition is the scores of people who die of heart attack at the age of 55, the kids who are 18 years old, who never got the chance to experience their life with their father, knowing that that father was going to die when they turned 55. It's all of the people who lose out on friends, who didn't get to experience that friendship to its fullest capacity constantly. So we're going to bring you 2 points. Firstly, how it improves happiness for people, for individuals, and makes them happier, and secondly, how it helps all of the people around them. Quick response to opening opposition. On the idea that being fearful on a day-to-day basis, but uncertainly fearful, helps you operate better. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the way that people tend to respond to uncertain fear. I think in the vast majority of cases, it paralyzes people. It makes people quite incapable of responding with any kind of rational choice because they don't know whether they're going to die tomorrow or they're going to die in 10 years, even given the example, the hypothetical set up by the last speaker. I think it would be far preferable for that person to know that they're going to die in 10 years as opposed to maybe dying tomorrow, because they might be able to make choices for their lives that will make them happier 6 years, 7 yease, 8 years down the road, and that's preferable. The second thing to say, though, is just that the way that kids internalize things about the world is that they kind of bake them into their worldview. So it isn't the case that it's like we flip a switch and everybody goes from a world where this doesn't exist to a world where this does exist. So I don't think that people are going to live with this anvil hanging over their head in the same way that nobody lives with an anvil hanging over their head, knowing that they're going to die in 80 or 85 years. It's a social expectation that's going to be normalized, and the kids are going to be able to internalize quite easily within themselves. By the way, it's far preferable to the realization in adulthood that you're going to have a certain end, which you think is the status quo today, that when you turn 45 or 46, the midlife crisis is the realization that you only have 30 years left of life, but you haven't spent a lifetime developing an understanding of the world around you and the relationships that you have based on that certain end time. We think that's far preferable on our side of the house in a comparative that they miss. So, how do we make people happier? How do we change individual behavior? We think that people often defer happiness. Now, open government uses very econ-heavy language for this, the tail risk and things I don't totally understand. We would put to you that people, and obviously this is all quite true, but we would put to you that the way that this truly operates most seriously is that people think that they can live out some kind of, that they can experience hardship early in their life, because later in their life they're going to experience satisfaction in relationships, that you forego earnings early in your life, that you forego meaningful relationships early in your life, that you bounce around from relationship to relationship and you never settle down in one place early in your life because of the expectation that you're going to be able to have that sometime down the road. For the person who dies at the age of 42, the person who dies at the age of 55, knowing that that's going to be the case allows you to make choices that you as an individual will value more in the long term and will bring you more long-term satisfaction. It allows you to construct relationships and to live a life that doesn't defer that happiness. Moreover, though, we think that because people aren't able to recognize how finite life is, it makes it quite a bit more difficult for them to appreciate it while it's happening. There's the truism that people don't know what the good times are until they're gone, but it's actually quite real. It's the reason why people living out the final days of their lives, the final years of their lives with loved ones with terminal diseases tend to describe them as the happiest times of their lives, because it's the time in your life where you're able to maximize to the greatest degree possible your day-to-day happiness and the way in which you enjoy the world. It gives you an appreciation for the world that you simply aren't able to have on their side of the house when you live your entire life believing that you have until forever. We think that putting a number on it is what allows people to live this on a day-to-day basis. But how do we affect other people? This is important. We think that people construct their relationships based on an expectation that those relationships will exist for a long period of time. We think that parenthood is often based on the expectation that you can be an a-hole to your parents while you're a child, because later on you're going to come together and you're going to have this long life with them. Knowing that you don't have that opportunity in the vast majority of cases is critical for these relationships to be enduring and to be based on choices that are made by people based on how much time they're going to have with someone else. The way in which you construct a friendship, or the way in which you enter into a relationship, being based upon an understanding of the finite period of time that you're going to have with that person, allows you to construct a type of relationship that's more meaningful to you, because it's based on exactly how much time you're going to have with them and the role that they're going to play in your life. It also structures the choices that you might make. So you might not choose to move away from home if you know when your parents are going to die. You might not choose to move away from a friend or to take extra time at work if you know when they're going to die. It allows you to make meaningful choices and trade-offs based on the finite period of time that you have with that individual, so that you can never get on their side of the house closing.
Given the model we get from opening government, where the vast majority of people will live to old age because most diseases are curable, the only people this impacts is the small amount of people who have an incurable disease. Doesn't this mean
Hundreds of thouusand of people die of heart attacks. I'm sorry to interrupt. Hundreds of thousands of people die of heart attacks and cancer every year. Those are covered on our side of the house because they are terminal, they're unpredictable, they happen, they can't be cured. It's a lot of people. This is a real debate. Opening.
So, knowing the fact that you can recover from heart attacks and cancer can be fixed by drug treatments, presumably all the problems of deferred happiness get worse when the vast majority of people know they are not going to die naturally to a very late period of time, but can still be killed by accidents and preventable diseases.
But that's true now. People know that they might die of accidents now and think that they'll live a long time. The trade-off in this debate are the people who are going to die earlier. We choose to believe this is a substantial number of people so that this debate has impact. If they choose not to believe that that's the case, fine. Okay. We think that informed choices about relationships allow people, one, to live their life with those people better, but two, in the cases when they lose those people, it allows them to internalize those losses significantly better. Because one, you've spent your entire life internalizing the loss of your own life, which means that you're probably more likely to experience death as a necessary component of life that you've understood since childhood, which means that you're able to internalize the loss of other people significantly better. But two, you also don't have that regret, because you believe that you lived that entire life with that person, knowing when they were going to lose them, and living it to the greatest capacity possible. We think that the very worst case is that we get a better approach to loss. But the best case is that you spend more time with these people with a genuine understanding of the way in which that relationship is going to operate at the point at which you lose it. You get better relationships, I think you get better approaches to loss, I think you get a better approach to your own life because you never defer happiness. We are just tremendously proud to propose.
Thank the object. Yeah, now we thank the member of government. Let's have the member of opposition.
I think in status quo, you are more likely to actually live day by day, take risks, and pursue passions because you don't know when your expiry date is. You don't know when you're going to go out. Could be tomorrow, could be 40 years from now. Not sure. I want to be able to plan. I want to be able to make the most of my life. I want to live now. I think that's what you actually see, that's what we see right now. I think that basically like the problem that we've seen down Gov Bench is that when you're looking at, for example, like spending time with more people, or spending more time with people, for example, who have low expiry dates, is that you can still die by accident, right? There's still, especially when like OG talks about how this is a global debate and it's global, blah, blah, blah. If you're from a very poor country and you see, oh, my expiry date is 85, because that's when I would naturally die, but there's a fucking war going on outside, there's mass poverty, or there's no hospitals, for example, or I'm too poor in America to access healthcare. I think it really sucks when you're 6 years old and you see that, I've been diagnosed with cancer at 6, but my expiry date is 85. I think it really sucks because you're going, wow, if I was rich enough, I'd make it to 85. I think that's the actual comparative. I think that's the actual comparative on the debate. I think that you're actually making it so that more people are feeling worse when you're actually looking at economic inequality. So I'm going to basically stand on relationships and the societal shift that we see, and I'll do explicit refutation throughout. So, first off, on approaches to life. Again, I think that when you have an uncertain future, and when you are very unsure about these things, I think that you make more meaningful relationships on a day-to-day basis. I think that you make these relationships that you're able to grow with, that you're able to have, because you don't necessarily know when you'll lose that person, or you don't necessarily know when you are going to be lost. So for example, I think that basically you're able to make the most of that, pursue your passions. Yeah, sure.
Let's be clear, in the developing world, your expiry date is later than you'd expect, creating hope and momentum for political change. In America, we explained why knowing about a heart attack at 40 for the small number of people it affects is incredibly important to their personal and family decision making. Why is either world bad?
So in the first world that you talk about, where you're poor and now there's hope and you're galvanizing, etc. No, that's just not the truth, right? You're producing a false reality. What actually happens is that there's still systemic structures, there's still colonialism, there's still patriarchy, there's still all these things that you can't get through to get through it. I don't think that just because you know that you could have lived longer, which status quo, you know you could have lived longer. I don't think just because of that's going to be able to make economic elites and political elites inside of that country all of a sudden change and have a change of heart because now you know for sure that you could have made it to 85. I think that they already know that you probably could make it to 85 if they had an American healthcare system, the rich American healthcare system. I think that they already know these things. I don't actually see how you're galvanizing any political change whatsoever. Didn't do enough to prove that. So, I think that basically, when you are certain about your expiration date. So, first let's look at for long term that we're talking about, right? Which they seem to care about. Again, I just talked about how if you're poor in America or living in a developing country or just a very corrupt country, for example, the accident of not being able to access healthcare, not being able to access your pills, and not being able to access these things really hurts you, right? But I think that this matters as well, and I've covered that. I think that this matters as well, though, for rich individuals, for individuals that have economic power, etc. Right? Because I think that it just makes you feel as though you can do tons of stuff later, right? I think that it basically means that you can actually have these life experiences later on. Right now, I don't really need to do much. Like I don't need to do much. I can, if I want to, take a 5-year sabbatical and pretty much just watch Netflix. Why? Because I know I'm not wasting these days. Because I have all those days in the future. I have all these years in the future to go with. No, thank you. I think that you're basically like. I feel basically like you're not being productive or forming meaningful relationships in this world, right? But secondly, let's look at if you have a short expiration date, just a small one, right? First off, on rich individuals, and I think that this also ties into what they were talking about earlier. I think that you're just less likely to want to pay into public programs that help people A, that grow older, but B, that for healthcare, etc., and research for that kind of thing, right? I think that you're less likely to actually do this because you know it doesn't affect you whatsoever. I want my money, I'm keeping it with me. I think that this is especially true when we're looking at, for example, research into incurable disease and prolonging life, right? I think that you see a lot less of that stuff that's going to actually extending the human expiration date from what it is right now of average age 85 to max 120 kind of thing into 180 somehow kind of thing. And the reason why is that even if this is untenable underneath the model that they give, I think that the research that develops from that and the byproduct research that you get from that actually helps cure diseases that we have right now, makes them less deadly. Actually, because of all those other things. Closing, yeah.
Are you more likely to try to make an impact on the world around you if you think that your primary focus needs to be making money 50 or 60 years down the road, which you will not actually reach, or if you think you have a finite period of time on Earth that's ending very soon that you can have it in?
I can't remember which one of the Gov speakers said it, but when they were talking about the apple over the head, and that you have, I think of Isaac Newton, right? Died a 25-year-old virgin, and yet still produced calculus, did these things, right? Or 35-year-old virgin, I can't remember. Anyway, died virgin. So I think that's important. I think it's important to recognize that even with the fact that dying soon, you still even with the fact that you might do this, it's a long thing. I think that's a very personal decision. I don't think I think it's a personality-based decision. I don't think it's really affects with age, right? So I think that what you actually see though overall is that you're going to basically YOLO it, right? So they talk about midlife crises and how these look really bad, etc. I think that this midlife crisis just becomes a lifelong crisis, right? I think it becomes a lifelong crisis of constantly seeing these things. So I think that, for example, you make more rash decisions without having real connections and real meaningful relationships with individuals, because you're just going through life, you're just doing all these things. Let's look at people who have midlife crises, right? They distance themselves from their family. They go oh, I'm going to march all by myself. I don't think you actually think I need to make an impact on society. I think you just think oh, I just need to live for me. You end up not living for yourself though, because you're not having meaningful relationships. You're not connecting with individuals, right? I think even the fact that you feel you would hurt those around you because you know you're going to die soon, so you purposely only make short-term relationships. I think for all those reasons, we stand opposed. Thank you.
Thanks.
To know we don't have computer if possible.
Yeah, you can.
Thank you. Sorry.
No. To back. Because it has to go to this.
Take off the camera. It's have enough button.
Yeah, if you take it and flip it, probably. So, yeah. That should be. The converter.
Thank you.
That's one.
I need 20 seconds for software.
Choose better prose during speech.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh.
It's the second one button.
And preferable synonyms. Some literature quote.
If you want to tell a joke that has nothing to do with the debate, you can. It's hard to follow the best joke in the history of humanity.
What was the joke?
Okay, it sounds like we're good. Now we need to thank the member of opposition. Let's have the top whip.
Pedals, people are defined by their relationships with others. And I want to make something clear. When Ruben comes up here and tells you that other people choose to define themselves differently in relation to how they view the expiration dates of others, when they can plan around their own priorities and lives with respect to other people, with respect to their families, and how they choose to actualize value in their lives, that's what we all care about because it's what people ought to choose to define for themselves. I'll give rebuttal explicitly to CO, then OO, then we'll talk about how people construct worlds and the weighing that probably hasn't happened thus far in this debate. So closing off rebuttal. They say people are going to do stuff later because Netflix is awesome now and I have 80 years to live. Like, probably not, but also probably true in both worlds, right? If you have a lot of time to live, and generally people expect they're going to live a long time, we're wasting time in either world. I don't think that significantly changed in either case. Second, they say public programs, we give up on those who are going to live a short period of time. First, I think just generally, people can marshal sympathy in their favor here. But importantly, I don't think that the government should force a child who's going to die at 15 to go through 12 years of schooling. Like, that's just probably not the best thing for their own lives. We would rather that child be able to maximize the time on earth they have while they are here, and if that's not achieving a high school education, then so be it. We can make those trade-offs. I think society probably will make those trade-offs at the point when they exist. Similarly for research, like this motion gives us interesting fiat power, and that now we know when things are inevitable and when things are not. That is to say, we can better allocate resources to places where it can pay off. It's cheeky, but like, if they're going to say research is allocated less poorly, like, fiat allows us to make impossibly good decisions. We're perfectly happy to take advantage of that. Then they say short expiration dates exist, people are going to YOLO. Probably pertinent to my previous analysis, but like, good? Like, if people have very little time on Earth and want to take more risks, on that basis, we're completely fine with that. Ruben also tells you that sometimes they're going to like better the Earth in their short time here because that's where they find value. Honestly, like, either way is perfectly fine. I'm not going to judge people for choosing how to spend their time. Second OO rebuttal, 4 responses. They tell us their main case is regret and fear is created. This creates less happiness. This has to outweigh everything else because less happiness is the terminal value. 3 responses. First, note that POI from me and then the POI from Bobby effectively mitigates both of the premises on which they place their case. That is to say, I POI, but we have an upper limit already at 110. They say, oh no, it's not about the upper limit, it's about the exactness. Then Bobby POIs, but people die at random times all the time. And they say, no, it's not about the exactness, it's about the upper limit. What then do you define your conception of value on top of? It's completely unclear. Second, look, they try to make it a very philosophical argument, but at the end of the day, their impact relies on a very psychological term. That is to say, how do people perceive their own death? How are they likely to view it? A few problems with this. Their assertion that some people with Huntington's choose not to know when they're going to die is probably true the opposite way. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but presumably people choose one or the other in different times. In fact, we would say the platitudes that we find throughout people who've just had a heart attack or have just come to terms with the fact that they're going to die soon are in general that each day is a gift that I was then likely to maximize my own value. Look, analysis is fine, but at the end of the day, we do have examples of people who know their expiration dates. We would plausibly say these people's lives are a better example of this. Third response, though, look, people just normalize fear. That is to say that at the point when you grow up with something from childhood and have that expectation, we don't by and large think that they're going to live their lives under the constant fear of death because we are capable of pushing it off in the ways that we all do. Because I don't see a meaningfully underlying philosophical difference between 50 years and 100 years and 200 years. The fact is we all have a limited time on this earth and we all find ways to push that off and have fun in the meantime. Ruben's material then. Look, I want to make something very clear. When opening government comes up here and says people make different decisions with this knowledge, this framework is broad enough to encompass all possible human action. What Ruben gives you specifically then is how people change in relation to others, but more importantly, how people, regardless of their own expiration dates, can change in response to other people's expiration dates. A pertinent example here is perhaps that if I as a child or I as a family can plan around the father dying, which is my single source of income, a massive amount of human suffering can be averted on that basis. He gives you 3 impacts here. First, childhood is the best possible time to form values around your possible expiration date. He tells you that broadly, people tend to come to grips with their own morality around middle age, that is to say, middle life crisis. But whenever it happens, it's usually not during childhood. Why is this important? because people form values during childhood as though they are going to live an extended period of time and then choose to actualize their own life on the basis of those values. This means that at the time when they realize their life is shorter, they now have a value system that is incompatible with the life they must lead. That is to say, the values they have chosen to construct for themselves are incompatible with the life they have been given. On the other hand, if we let children know before they have formed values and preconceptions about what they want their life to be, when they can expire, those values can be constructed around that life. Go.
So, again, the accident of not being able to access healthcare, what do you actually think happens to individuals who see that their expiration date could be 85, but know that they're just not going to make it that way? They're living in a spiral.
To be honest, everyone on the panel probably has their own conception of how this mishmash and mess of this back and forth played out. I don't think I'm going to meaningfully change it by adding a quip to it. But probably this debate has some impacts we're going to presume as though some people's values and actions are changed on the basis of that. Second, impact on others and how you perceive their expiration dates. That is to say, yeah, sure.
Like we explained under the status quo, you can normalize death because you can push the concept away from an early age and deal with it when you're ready. The upper limit you always are certain of makes that impossible. Given that this fear affects everyone, and very few people are going to die of a completely incurable disease that no human can affect, we probably affect more people.
All right, they've returned to the upper limit as their basis for why humans have to act certain ways. But note that that upper limit exists for children as well. The fact that that upper limit is now variable, that is to say it might be 50, it might be 100, doesn't really make an impact on how people choose to push off death. The psychology works either way. All right, look. Impact on others. People plan relationships around when people are going to expire. That is to say, one of the highest values people have for their own lives is, did I get to spend enough time with my parents? Did I get to say goodbye? Did I maximize the time I had while it was there? Given that's the value people choose to ascribe to themselves, we presumably think it weighs out heavily in this debate. But also it's about planning for the death of others. That is to say, when children are left without a source of income, when their lives become significantly worse because someone who didn't properly plan for their own sudden death from a heart attack or whatever it is that takes their life becomes inevitable. Finally, weighing in this debate. Look, let's say that people can both make better decisions, but also inevitably feel some regret about those decisions. Here's the important clash, assuming the case of both worlds. To be clear, regret is a real emotion. It's based on the fear of a thing that of not doing a thing that you care about. Given that that's the case, we would rather people be able to make the decisions that improve their own lives, given that definitionally, feeling regret means they care about those things. This weighing means that we would prefer to give people that option rather than strip it from them for those that make those choices. Proud to propose.
Okay. Thanks to the government. Let's have the upward.
There was no leader in court. There was no leader in court.
I want to make something very clear about the wording of the info slide. It told us that the natural expiration date cannot be you cannot go further than that. That means it's the upwardmost limit of however you can live your life. That means if malaria can be cured, but you didn't get a cure for malaria, that was an accident, that's not the limit to which you can live your life. That means if you have cancer, but you die of cancer that could have been curable if you were in a different place, that's not the limit that you're going to see, or intuitively sense. Though I'm still going to deal with the kind of mismatch on how many diseases this affects. I would tell you it mostly affects the fact that some diseases are uncurable, specific types of cancer are uncurable. I don't think it actually affects the vast majority of people, which means the vast majority of people are going to care a lot less because they don't have personal connections to those people. I'm just going to talk about how this impacts people who live the long life. Recognize that this is most people, given the framework we get from OG. Why? They say that the vast majority of people in developing countries will see that their natural life expectancy is longer than the life they live. That means that they agree that the vast majority of people will have a sense that they're living a long life. This has massive impacts on the way that people view things like healthcare, Medicare, which I'm going to get into later on my second point, which is your short life. Okay, so on people who live long lives. On the personal, right? So in terms of relationships, Alex gives you two things that I think are important. But first of all, what gut gives you. So they say that oftentimes you forego meaningful relationships in the status quo, you delay them, whatever it is. Now it shows you how important these are. Recognize that due to uncertainty, you do this under the status quo. As a teenager, you fall in love, you try to make the best friends of your life because you're not sure when you're going to die. We agree that people think I'll die at 85, but the fact that they have no certainty if they're going to get a disease in the next year makes that less certain. Recognize that most people, when they have an intuitive sense of their natural life, are going to internalize that as the day they die. This is important because it's the premise that all of the government arguments are based on, that this is the thing that you view as the time you're going to die, even though you might die earlier, right? That means that people no longer have that sense of uncertainty. It means they're willing to delay things. For example, giving back to causes that they care about, getting involved in their communities, because they feel like they can take time for themselves because they have the time, even if they don't. No thanks. On terminal diseases, right? So we get from closing government, basically, that it's important to plan around people dying, and you want to spend time with people with terminal diseases. A few points. Firstly, for the vast majority of terminal diseases, you tend to know in advance that that person has some sort of disease or isn't doing well, so you can still spend time with them on either side of the house. In terms of surprise heart attacks, which is the only response we get from government, I would tell you this is outweighed by the fact that they want you to do riskier things when you know that you're not going to live long. What does that mean? You're more likely to die by a certain type of accident. This is amplified by the fact that the second speaker on side government tells us that you shouldn't do things like eat healthily, like eat salads or exercise, because those things are boring and painful, which means you're even more likely to die earlier. So it actually outweighs the number of people who get surprise heart attacks and died in those instances. I would also tell you that planning around people dying is very painful, and I would want it for the least amount of people possible. Why? Because you're constantly in crisis mode. If you know that somebody that you love is going to die in a year or 2 years, you try to do everything to center your life around them. Although that can seem good, it's actually really painful, not only for you and your future past that person, because you've completely centered your life and its importance around that individual. That means after they die, it's even harder to disconnect from them. When somebody dies by surprise, for example with a heart attack, it is really hard to get over. That being said, you have other relationships in your life that are meaningful and that you've actually been able to nurture because you haven't been centered on that person, which makes it easier to cope. Sure.
If you have little education, little property, and everyone around you has died before the age of 40, why would you think you would have potential to live longer, and why would you lobby the government for changes that would allow you to do so?
So you see a bunch of your friends dying. You probably want to stop that, right? You probably decide it'd be better if my friends didn't die because I love my friends, and I want to make sure the government is implementing policies that make my friends not die. I think that when you know you could have lived longer and you have that date stamped on you, it just reinforces the unfairness and the sadness. But the problem is you're already mobilized enough to try to change the fact that your friends are dying because you don't want them to fucking die. I think you have pretty good incentives under the status quo. Okay. On societal advocacy, so this gets perfectly into the point they raised on you should have lived longer. Recognize in the status quo, we know there are disparities between the average lifetimes in different areas and in different regions, right? The problem is people still don't do that much about it, so I don't think that the fact that we know this for a certainty instead of know it based on statistics will really change anything, right? But I tell you, it does create a massive crisis for you and a lot of sadness for you that I think is oftentimes going to actually limit your ability to advocate for advocacy, insofar as, I think I've established, you have huge incentives for advocacy on both sides of the house. Okay, on your short life. So, recognize that this applies to whether or not a lot of people are having diseases that are predicted on their thing, as back half tells you, or it's not a lot of people because malaria is curable, as front half tells you, which by the way is a knife, back half. Okay, so on public programs, I think it's important to recognize that the reason why we have good health care and good insurance is, actually I'll take you first.
On your side, people devalue time spent with loved ones versus things that are tangible and feel finite. Wouldn't it be preferable for them to be able to reflect their interests based on a choice that values both as tangible and both as finite?
So the problem is this is very different for if you're a person who has a long life or a short life, and if you know people who have short lives, that's why I'm dividing in those two circumstances, but the rest will be addressed when I get to relationships, which is my second point. Okay. On public programs, recognize the reason why we have good funding, both private and public, for things like Medicare is because people know there's a chance you're going to get a disease and die. Why is this important? In private sectors, you need enough people to buy insurance. This is the premise of Obamacare, so that's financially feasible for the average person to have health insurance. I would tell you, when the vast majority of people, and this is the OG model, know that they're only going to die at like 80, 85, they have no incentive to get health insurance, or very little incentive to get as the amount of coverage of health insurance. This is what Alex tells you. This is bad because it means prices go up for people who are going to live a short life, right? People who actually need the type of healthcare that's going to extend their life to the natural end. I think this is really bad. It also happens in the public sector because less people are likely to actually want their taxes to go through to public healthcare in the same way, which means they're going to vote for politicians who want to cut public care. This has massive impacts on everybody, more people die, etc. So on closing government, on relationships, sorry. So this is a response to the POI. They tell us, for people with short lives, you no longer delay your relationships, right? You want to do them right away. The problem is, having relationships with people that you know are going to die in 2, 5, 10 years is really, really hard for people. I would tell you the vast majority of people will try not to form these relationships because they don't want to hurt the people that they realize they're going to love. Alex tells you, and I think this is super impactful, because it means that you actually have less relationships.
Thanks to everyone.